Hello, I'm Dr Erin O'Donnell at the Centre for Resources, Energy and Environment Law at the University of Melbourne Law School. What you're about to see is a short presentation from the fantastic Dr Rachel Killean from the University of Sydney on the rights of nature on the island of Ireland. We hope you enjoy. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a Friday to hear Rachel speak about the rights of nature on the island of Ireland. I'm going to start by acknowledging country. So we're all meeting here today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I acknowledge that they've never ceded their sovereign rights to care for lands and waters. So that's a really useful jumping off point, I think, for us to remember that we are here in a settler colonial country and there are significant parallels to the conversation that Rachel is going to be having about the island of Ireland. We're really lucky to have Rachel here today. I was super excited when she told me she was coming down to Melbourne. I met Rachel for the first time at the Frontiers and Environmental Law Conference this year. I'm just going to read out some of her fabulous history. So Dr Rachel Killean is a senior lecturer at Sydney Law School and a member of the Sydney Institute of Criminology, the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and the Sydney Environment Institute. She's also an honorary senior lecturer at the Queen's University Belfast School of Law. Dr Killean's research centres responses to violence with a focus on transitional justice, victims' rights, sexual and gender-based violence, and harms perpetrated against the natural world. Today, Rachel is going to be talking about her recent research onto the rights of nature. And I think without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel.
Great, thank you. Does that sound right? Yes, for recording. Thank you so much, Erin. Yeah, it's so nice to be here and to get to see you again and get to talk about this topic again. Thank you for the acknowledgement of country. I also just want to acknowledge that I was lucky enough to write this paper on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's a real privilege to be able to live in that beautiful land, but also raises questions around our positionality as settlers and what that means when we engage in this type of research. Indigeneity might not spring out as a theme when you think about the island of Ireland, but as I'm going to show you today, it's surprising how actually central it is to movements in a place where we might not naturally think about an Indigenous population. Just by way of overview, I'll give you a little context to the rights of nature movement across the island of Ireland. I'll introduce the project and my collaborators. And then I want to focus on the origins and drivers. So the project actually focuses on origins, drivers, and then kind of the barriers and challenges. But when we were writing up our findings, there was so much to say that we've split it. So I'm going to focus today on origins, but we are working on a paper to kind of a sister paper, if you like, that will explore some of the challenges around this movement as well. So by way of context then, in June 2021, we have the first local council declaration recognising the rights of nature. This is followed in the following days by a movement in Fermanagh and Omagh, and then in Belfast City Council, September 2021, and then December 2021, we see it on the other side of the border in the Republic of Ireland in Donegal. The motions mirror each other in that they're identical. So this is the Omagh one, but they all read much the same. So they note their connection to a global movement, a legal and social movement, as you can see at the top there. They talk about rights of nature as a way of challenging extractivism and offering a different way of thinking about protecting nature. They set out some actions. So these are not legally binding documents, but they do request that the council engage in consultation and move towards a declaration and think about how rights of nature might be adapted in different kind of local council documents, such as community plans. And then they call on other councils to join them in making similar motions. So my colleagues and I were struck by the relative lack of research into rights of nature across Europe. So to date, a lot of the research on rights of nature understandably focuses on the US and the movement there, South America, in South Asia, India, Nepal, and then settler colonial states such as Australia and New Zealand. However, rights of nature does seem to be gaining traction across Europe. You can see that in movements in Spain to recognize a river as a legal person. There's movements to make constitutional change in Germany. There's these local council movements across the UK and Ireland. And the EU itself has given thought to what rights of nature might mean for the EU itself. So that raises questions about what does it mean for rights of nature to spark in Europe? You know, we tend to associate rights of nature, as I mentioned at the start, with places where there's a strong Indigenous rights movement. What does it mean in a place where we don't necessarily think in those kinds of terms? What are the things that have sparked a rights of nature movement? So we wanted to dig into this using this kind of unexpected case study. Like, the island of Ireland is not known for environmental innovation, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So myself and Jeremy Gilbert, who comes from an Indigenous rights background, and Peter Doran, who comes from an environmental law in Ireland background, got together to do a small scale qualitative study, which looks at what does this case study show us about the drivers and barriers, whether that's philosophical, cultural, political, or legal, to pursuing rights of nature across Europe. And then what are the implications of pursuing this, and the implications of local initiatives in particular. So again, it's a small scale study. We spoke to 15 individuals who were intimately connected to the movements. So obviously it's not a representative study. There are lots of different perspectives on rights of nature across the island of Ireland, but we were interested in the perspectives of those that had decided to pursue this as an initiative. We also drew less formally on our own participation in an event called The Gathering, which was a collection of environmental activists who gathered to discuss rights of nature in June in 2021. And then also on our experience of working with the Environment Justice Network of Ireland to make submissions to the Irish Assembly on biodiversity laws around rights of nature. So you can see that this is an insider study. Obviously, this was something that I was connected to during my time living on the island of Ireland, and so should be understood in that context. You know, I come to this with a very particular pro kind of positioning. And then just to acknowledge that we received funding from Queen's University and then subsequently from the University of Sydney. So very grateful to both of them for facilitating this. So participants were asked, you know, where did you first hear about this term? What does this term mean to you? What kind of strategies do you think are necessary to pursue rights of nature? How does it intersect with environmental law, other kinds of initiatives? And, you know, what do you think the main challenges are? And so for a lot of our participants, they could trace the first time that they heard about this term to, you know, the perspective of international initiatives, and that doesn't really make sense. The perspective of international organizations that are pushing for rights of nature. So you see this explicitly mentioned in the language of the rights of nature motions themselves, and then it came through in the interviews as well. So most people traced their first encounter with rights of nature to a presentation by Mary McGill and Thomas Lindsay, who are two lawyers that work with CELDF, the Community Environment Legal Defence Fund. So they came over in 2019. They have a long-standing relationship with environmental organisations in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland. They came to Queen's University. I went to the seminar. I was actually quite unimpressed by them. I find that they are not very good at acknowledging kind of Indigenous perspectives on rights of nature. So it didn't really leave much impact on me, but other activists in the room were extremely struck by it. So if we look at interview 4 with a local councillor, she was saying, they're lawyers and stuff. I don't have a legal head on me, but I have an environmental injustice head on me. And I liked that they were saying that the only thing environmental regulations regulate are the environmentalists. So that was a key theme of their presentation, was how fatigued they were with trying to bring about change using traditional environmental law. And then the environmental activists that invited them said, you know, the rights of nature movement that we lit the touch paper for here was more to do with their power analysis and their analysis of jurisprudence. And they were very struck by the fact that it had come to a point where a law firm in the US had the strength of mind to say, that's it, we've had enough. So this is reflective of CELDF's very acknowledged strategy that they seek to work with communities to encourage them to use rights of nature to advocate for environmental protection. And so if you were to look at a mapping of rights of nature networks, the places that it's been sparked in the US are all places that CELDF have been and, you know, advocated for this approach. They also went to Ecuador in 2008 to kind of push for rights of nature there. They've worked in India. You know, they are very clear in what it is that they are trying to achieve. So this is a expected finding. And in a mapping in 2022 of rights of nature initiatives, they were found to be the third biggest node. So if we think about organizations that are connected, they were only after the UN Harmony with Nature organization, and then GARN, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. But it also demonstrates how important these like transnational links are, and that communities trying to advocate for environmental protection will look to see where it's being done elsewhere. And so there's different perspectives on whether rights of nature is a movement or movements. It doesn't really matter, but what matters is communities are taking inspiration and then making it their own. And so that came through in this quote by a lawyer who, like myself, was not particularly impressed by Mary and Thomas, but later reflected on, as I have done, what this was actually about and what this actually meant. So she says they spoke about things in a theoretical, lofty way and related a lot to examples that happen in the States. And I was sitting there thinking, well, that's all well and good, but we the people doesn't really apply here. We don't have that kind of constitutional setup. But she went on to say, now, like years have passed, I understand that it's about sowing the seed and that we were to make it reflective of Northern Ireland. So that was a Northern Irish-based lawyer. And that was what really came through in our interviews, was that despite having heard about this term from an American organization, for the activists and the councillors that were in the room that day, this was something that instantly resonated with ideas that they already had and represented a new way to discuss these issues that really felt to them grounded in their understanding of their relationship to place. So that came through in lots of really interesting ways. So for the councillor at the top there, I'm very interested in Irish mythology and that Indigenous connection of Irish people and Irish language. I think rights of nature touch on that, you know, in a way. And then the second quote, this reference to townsland names. So it struck her, she has some Gaelic. I love translating townsland names, you know, and that whole sense of how our townland names are directly related to nature and where we live in nature. It transforms how you view your environment. So what they are referencing is kind of pre-colonial relationship to land that existed in Ireland in their imaginary anyway. So that reference to townland names is a reference to the prior method of naming towns in Ireland was an oral tradition, and they would use, you know, the use of the land, the mythology of the land, the location of the land to construct town names. And then with colonialism came the ordnance survey, the creation of maps, the imposition of Anglified place names. And for folks who advocate for Irish language rights, part of their resistance to that is reclaiming those townland names. And so that connection to Irish mythology and also Irish language was for them a reflection of the fact that there are connections to place that exist in Ireland that are damaged and ruptured by colonialism and that can be best understood in their own language and in their own way of understanding place names in particular. And so that also came through in references to customary law and intangible heritage. So at the top there, there's an argument from ancient Irish customary law that says if we're not healthy, then the ruler forfeits their right to govern. And for me, that's probably the most interesting principle from looking at what's called Brehon law. Now, Brehon law has a long history. It's a pre-colonial customary law that existed in Ireland that merged over time with Christian ideas, but did manage to revive for a while before it was eventually entirely replaced with a colonial settler legal structure. And the law that he's referring to was one where, as part of a king's, there was many kings in Ireland before colonialism, but when a king was coronated, they were married to the land in a kind of like fertility ceremony. And the idea was that that was to make the land fertile. And if the land was not then fertile, then that was the king forfeiting their right to govern because they had not adequately cared for the land. So it's premised on the idea that we need flourishing land, but land also needs adequate protection and efficient rulership. And that same body of law is linked to the second quote. So the second quote talks about believing in the notion of the fairy tree. If there was one on my land, definitely I would not be cutting it down. So that mythology is that if you cut down a fairy tree, you bring bad luck onto your community. And that is also found in that customary law. So there are laws that govern the relationship between people and trees. And there were it's not a particularly retributive body of law, but you would have to offer reparation if you cut down a tree. And that changed depending on the cultural significance of the tree. So if it was a sacred tree, a tree that contained fairy people, or spirits, or just had significance for the community, you had to pay more reparation because these were trees that required protection. Now, obviously, as Christianity took over, and these mythologies kind of faded, that became less important, but still a relevant part of Irish life. Like, you have cases of roads being redirected to avoid certain trees. You have farmland where you can see fields stretching around, but then trees in the middle that people don't want to touch. They might be a bit shamefaced about it, and they might talk about it in this kind of sheepish way. You can see there, well, we believe in all of the well, with a small b, I suppose, but it's still part of cultural life. And so rights of nature to these interviewees connected to that idea of relationship to land that predates Ireland's colonization. And then for some, this is made more explicit through the connection they made between rights of nature and resistance to colonialism and colonial legacy. So for one councillor, she thought it was significant that it had arisen in a place that has experienced a lot of Indigenous struggle. And then the second, you have this idea of the graft of your native land. And the second councillor was talking about, in colonial times, people were driven off good land into the mountains where it was perceived that the land was less good. And this happened from the 1500s right through to the 1900s, this process of land dispossession. But now the mountains are where they have found gold. So now people are being driven back out of the mountains because they want access to those resources. So for him, he took this long view that this is just another stage of this back and forth resistance and arguments over land. And indeed, my colleagues in Belfast, Fiona Neolin and Bill Rolston, they've talked about, if you scratch at the surface in Ireland, actually it's legacies of colonialism that dictate so many of the contemporary challenges and disputes that we have. And these ideas around land dispossession have completely influenced current relationships to land in Ireland, and this real protectiveness over land that's emerged and sustained to this day. But if you know anything about the island of Ireland, you know that framing rights of nature in this kind of language is extremely contentious and sensitive. So the idea of Ireland as a colony is complicated by Ireland's own role in subsequent colonization. It's kind of thought of as like the first colony of the UK. And obviously they're European and they're white. So like looking at them through that kind of like colonial lens can get a bit messy. Then you also have the separation of the island into two states, the conflict that came up around that, and the polarization of narrative, where you have this Protestant kind of loyalist population that's extremely resistant to having conversations that see the island in those terms. And then you have a Republican Catholic community. It's not always that simple, but it's kind of become entrenched in those terms, that really feels this connection to history as a way of resisting that kind of British understanding of the north of Ireland. On top of that, you have the imaginary of Ireland that exists, of it being this magical place, mystical place, that before colonization, it was this idealized Gaelic-speaking land. And that idea of Ireland can be very alienating to those that don't fit neatly into that understanding of the place. So for Protestants, for non-Gaelic speakers, for people that don't engage in kind of Irish cultural life, that can be a bit confronting and can make them feel like outsiders. So when you look at rights of nature in that lens, you risk alienating people that might otherwise feel a connection to the movement. And so that came through in these quotes where there was a resistance to that particular narrative about rights of nature. So in the top there, one of the council legal officers that we spoke to said, I don't think there's anything uniquely Irish about the concept, uniquely Celtic about the concept, or uniquely British about the concept. And then he said, well, we all have our problems. We all like to sort of think that our community is unique and particularly receptive to good ideas, which I thought was a really funny reflection on that. And then one of the councillors said, actually, what's important about rights of nature and the environmental movement more broadly is that it crosses these divides. I don't think about what religion they are, because climate change goes beyond creed. I suppose bringing it as a socialist rather than a nationalist party or a unionist party helps to challenge that misconception. So she's referring to the first motion in Derry, which was brought by a socialist party. But it's worth noting that these motions tend to be supported by Republican parties, and that therefore sets the tone for the debates that follow. So there was a strong cultural resonance with rights of nature, but that was not the only reason that people were drawn to it. And what cross-cut against this idea of cultural resonance was this idea that we need something to challenge the inadequate governance and change the system of our environmental governance on the island of Ireland. So that photo is near where I used to live. That used to be all trees. They paved it over to facilitate flood protection. It obviously floods much more now because trees are a really good flood protector. So that's the kind of like management that we face on a daily basis, particularly in the north of Ireland, but across the island. And you see that reflected in these quotes. I don't think the kind of environmental protection we have at the moment is particularly appealing. It's box ticking largely. And then in the second quote, environmental legislation, if it worked the way it should and was enforced in the way it should, we probably wouldn't need to have this conversation. Part of the reason why this has come about is because people clearly fear for ecosystems. So that fear is well placed. In the south of the island, we have this real emphasis on economic progression at any cost. In fact, I don't know if you saw, like, Michael Higgins, the president of Ireland, recently made a speech in which he condemned this approach and, called for a different way of thinking about economic development on the island. And then in the north, you have a political system that is really dominated by sectarianism. So the power sharing is designed to manage that history of sectarian conflict, and it sucks up a lot of the oxygen, which means there's not a lot of room for other really important conversations. And so what you have is environmental crime rarely resulting in accountability. You have Europe's largest illegal dump just outside Derry. You have the retrospective granting of permission for extractive practices, and a real connection between state and corporate interests that leads people to feel like they're living in a place where state crime and corporate crime are happening around them. And so you see that in this quote from one of the councillors, that for them, your government is meant to be protecting your air and your water and your environment, but they're the people that are bringing these companies in. They're not only inviting them in, but they're facilitating it. So he's referring to that retrospective granting of permission for illegal extractive practices there. So, I mean, the largest scandal in the north of Ireland was the renewable heating initiative, which was just before this research was taking place, in which people were offered money for using renewable sources, but there was no cap placed on it, so people could profit from burning renewables. So people were just burning wood, so like heating empty sheds. And the people that were benefiting the most were friends of people in power. So that was one of the things that brought down the government in the north of Ireland, which I'll talk about in a second. So these are not paranoid delusions. This is an accurate reflection of life on this island. And then you have, the spectre of Brexit making things difficult. So what does it mean for cooperation on the island of Ireland when they no longer have the same environmental regulations, or as put by one legal officer, it doesn't make things like this easier. But then you also have the complete inability of the Northern Irish government to function on any given day. It's repeatedly collapsed since, I think, 2017 was the first in recent memory, but this is a continuing practice. The RHI scandal that I just mentioned brought them down, but then you have the rise in popularity of Republican parties and the unionist parties' paranoia over that. So it's very hard if you live in the north of Ireland to know how to advocate for change. So you see that in the second quote, they'll say, now we need to write to the minister. And I'm like, what minister are we bloody well talking about? They're not even working, they get elected and then they fall out about something and all these decisions are made backdoor. So for a period of many years, policies in the north of Ireland were being made by civil servants. So we have an absolute breakdown of democracy as well, which makes it very difficult to advocate for change. And I think that you can see there why there was priority given to local council initiatives where people felt like they could make change. And so you see that here in this quote about getting embroiled in that horrible system. And this councillor was saying, this really wears you out. It's not nourishing for you. As someone that wants to protect the environment, you don't want to be spending the whole time fighting to prevent the destruction of it. So I just love that, changing the system by which we're fighting for protecting nature. So for her, rights of nature is just a more positive way of framing these challenges, and I think in Ireland, it can be very hard to resist, and I think elsewhere as well, it can be hard to resist planning developments, planning permissions through the court system. So you just spend your time losing. And so for her, rights of nature was at least something proactive and positive instead of constantly pushing back against this, tidal wave of development. And then in the second quote, I think there's the potential of a rights of nature approach was adopted to alter the approach you take to the interaction between planning and the environment. So without getting into kind of the technical aspects, a lot of people mentioned planning. This was something, I guess, because planning was one of the ways that environmental activists have been trying to make a difference for a very long time and failing. So they're thinking, if you give nature more rights, how does that, change the balance between planning decisions and environmental protection? And you see that in the language of the motions themselves. So we believe that rights of nature can inspire innovative rethinking about how to create regenerative, not extractivist economies. And this is a little bit snidey once you start talking to people about it. So they say the positive work already being done by council staff and groups in the climate emergency are commendable, but we recognise the need for a rights-based approach. They do not commend the work of the council and groups on the climate emergency. That came through really strongly. But one of the main points of resistance and tension came between the councillors who are elected and then the council officers who are tasked with implementing this. So I think this was a kind of peace gesture, you're doing great work, but it's not enough and it's not really working. And so despite the challenges that I've just highlighted, there were also perceptions that the unique history of Ireland actually makes it an incubator for new ideas. So the environmental movement was perceived to be more sophisticated than elsewhere across the islands of the UK because it has engaged for a long time with the idea that power comes from below. So because of the repeated failures of government, because of the legacy of a conflict, there was a perception that we are used to civil society organizing, we understand what it takes to bring about change, and therefore this is actually a good place, and it makes sense that rights of nature sparked here compared to other places. So where did they go from here? So our interviews were taking place in 2021. Unfortunately, not much has happened since, and part of that is just to do with the nature of what these motions actually are. So you can see here that they advocated for a series of meetings, for people to engage with civil society and to think about how we could operationalize this concept. So they had visions of rights of nature being integrated into community plans, corporate plans, other strategic frameworks at a council level, and that maybe there could be a future more strongly worded declaration for the rights of nature, and then an idea that more and more councils should be doing this. But the challenge comes because a local council cannot change law by itself, So there was a previous attempt to advocate for rights of nature in Frome in England that was struck down by the UK government, who perceived it to be a duplication of existing environmental rights, which activists would say is a complete misreading of rights of nature. But it shows the kind of legal challenge that this kind of initiative faces, and the same restrictions on local council powers exist in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. So while the devolved powers, so for example, Stormont, the Northern Irish Assembly, could probably go further, at a local council level, you hit a limit as to what you can do. So this came through, we interviewed the mayor in Derry, and she said, if you want to make bigger change, you have to go to the executive, the Irish government, the UK government, or even the EU, because as it stands, if you're going up against planning policy, you're just going to be subjected to judicial review, and you're not really going to be able to make change. And then for a legal officer, he was saying, in my day-to-day work, nothing's changed, and it won't change until the law changes, because that's the way things are, and we have to deal with it. So this was someone that was very pro rights of nature, but also was saying, I support this, I'm glad it's happened. My day-to-day work is exactly the same as it was yesterday. But we do see interesting developments. So in 2022, you have the Citizens' Assembly for Biodiversity Loss in the Republic of Ireland, and they recommended a referendum for constitutional change. So they believe rights of nature should be considered as part of Ireland's constitution, which is a pretty strong statement in support of rights of nature. And so that's already being implemented, not to the extent of a referendum, but they're disseminating proposals through the Republic's public participation network. So that allows for citizen-led input into their development plans. So there's already fairly local level developments that are seeking to operationalize rights of nature in different ways. And then you have dairy activists drafting victim impact statements on behalf of the Foyle River system, which is very lovely, where they are like making explicit connections between other environmental challenges, so in this case, the illegal dump outside Derry, and rights of nature. So thinking not only about protective rights of nature, but also rights to repair and rights to accountability for nature as well. So I don't think it's gone, but I do think the activists that were behind the local motions are not quite sure where you go next. You know, we have this small win. What happens now is a little bit difficult. And in the absence of something like New Zealand, where you have like a treaty framework for kind of pushing forward legal personhood, what does it actually mean to do rights of nature? We don't have loads of successful models to draw on. So that's kind of where they're at. But broader than that, I think there was a perception that even if nothing practically has changed, this was still worth it, because it gives people a framework. It gives people a way to think about nature, again, in a more proactive way. So for this environmental activist, it's raised the profile of rights of nature. It's made people connect with us who heard about it and thought, oh, rights is a framework that we can understand, and they get involved so they can raise awareness that way. And then for the mayor, it's just a different way of thinking about our business. So for her, it still prompted reflections about what local council business might look like, even in the absence of something more legally enforceable. So how can we understand this rise of a movement? So we found that it is both global and local. Global in the sense of being influenced and connected to international movements and international organizations, but local in that it was very grounded in what does it mean to be a person in this place, and how can it connect with our history and our cultural identity. Also, understandably, a reaction to extremely deep frustration with a system that has not and will not protect nature adequately. There is very little ancient forest left in Ireland. You know, the idea of it as this beautiful green island is just not a reflection of reality, and that's just really sad. And so there's a desire for something hopeful to pursue that's not just constantly trying to resist mining, trying to resist deforestation of that's left. And that while the motions aren't enough to change the law, they have sparked a new way of thinking about environmental governance. And there's a picture for you from the Ross Trevor gathering, which also featured, just to speak to that cultural point, some very practical strategic conversations about rights of nature, but then also music and poetry and other kind of cultural reflections on what is that we're protecting. There's Jeremy and I lost in the Sperrins. So we spent 2 weeks driving around talking to activists, but with my navigation skills and Jeremy's lack of knowledge of the island of Ireland, we were often lost, but that's all right. Nice way to appreciate nature. And then there's some resources as to where you can learn more about this. So as I said, we worked with the Environmental Justice Network of Ireland, so we have some briefings with them. Jeremy had done a scoping study prior to our research that looked at rights of nature in Europe, broadly defined, and then our write-up of this presentation we've submitted, but it's available on SSRN in its preprint form, and I'm happy to share any of those with you. Thank you.